Thanks, Denise. I want to thank everybody who's been so nice to me here at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Center. I've gotten to have a tour and seen the Benito Juarez exhibit, which I encourage all of you to go see when there isn't some very big event going on over there like there is right now. It's a fantastic show, and really the relationship between Juarez and Lincoln is so really intriguing. What I want to talk to you guys about today is my most recent book, A Wicked War, Polk, Lincoln, and the 1846 U.S. invasion of Mexico. The title, A Wicked War, is taken from a quote from Ulysses S. Grant. From late in his life, Grant looked back sort of on everything that he'd done in his career, and in his memoirs he writes very frankly about the experiences that he's had, the good and the bad, and it makes for really good reading. But one thing that Grant spent some time thinking and talking about late in his life was his role in the U.S.-Mexico War of 1846. And Grant said, at that time, I do not think there was ever a more wicked war than that waged by the United States on Mexico. I thought so at the time when I was a youngster, only I had not moral courage enough to resign. And Grant, of course, during the time of the U.S.-Mexico War was a young lieutenant. And I just found this a really moving quote, and that's why I took it for my title. Because the fact of the matter is that Grant was not alone in thinking that the U.S. invasion of Mexico was somehow wicked. One thing that I talk about in this book, and I'm going to talk about tonight, is the evolution of the American public during the course of the U.S.-Mexico War, which was not a long war by any means, from being really enthusiastic and in favor of invading Mexico to largely turning against the war. And I see the U.S.-Mexico War as the moment of America's first anti-war movement actually coming into being. So there was anti-war sentiment during the Revolution and certainly during the War of 1812, but that sentiment was limited. What you see happen in 1847 is a consensus really across the board. People from different regions of the country, soldiers in the field, officers, politicians, all deciding that a war that was being more or less successfully waged in another country was wrong and actually protesting that war. So I think this is a really interesting moment in American history, and it takes place in a war that people really don't know much about. The U.S.-Mexico War, people don't write about it a lot. It doesn't have a big place in sort of the historical imagination of Americans, and there's a number of reasons for that. It's often confused with the Texas Revolution that happened 8 years before, or ignored altogether. When historians do talk about the U.S.-Mexico War, they tend to think about the war in relationship to the Civil War. And they narrate the U.S.-Mexico War as sort of the first stop on the road to secession, arguing that the land that came from Mexico at the close of the war was what really caused sectionalism to heat up. And in fact, all that's true. So you can definitely look at the war as sort of the moment that the Civil War became inevitable, if you want to look at it that way, or you can look at it on its own terms, which is what I try to do in this book. What I really was interested in doing when I wrote this book was to show the impact of the war on individuals and on families. The U.S.-Mexico War had the highest mortality rate of any American war. 15% of soldiers who served in Mexico for the United States died. 78,000 troops served in Mexico, and it was a war that had a big impact on people at home. So I really wanted to write a narrative that explored how people in the United States and also in Mexico, how the war impacted them and their families. And some of the people that I talk about in this war are Abraham Lincoln, who makes his first major political speech, a speech that I found actually was quite widely documented and discussed in newspapers. His first major speech in Congress is about the U.S.-Mexico War. It's condemning the war. So Lincoln's first political stance on the national stage is actually against the U.S.-Mexico War. That's one person that I talk about. Another person I talk about is John J. Hardin, who some of you may be familiar with. He was a part of a very, very important family in Jacksonville. And for a period of time, he was the leading Whig politician in the state of Illinois, not Abraham Lincoln. And it's only Hardin's death in the U.S.-Mexico War that some people have argued makes Lincoln's path forward and his road to the presidency possible, because he was really under the shadow of John Hardin before that happened. Hardin's family is really fascinating, and they're deeply, deeply affected by the U.S.-Mexico War. Now let me tell you a little bit about the war, because I'm assuming that, like most people, you probably don't know a whole lot about it. The North American invasion, as it was known in Mexico, began when President James K. Polk sent troops into a disputed area between the Nueces and the Rio Grande rivers with the intention of starting a war. Polk wanted war. He was set on declaring war if the Mexican army didn't rise to the bait. In fact, the day before he found out that Mexicans had crossed the Rio Grande and killed 14 soldiers in this disputed area, Polk actually went to his cabinet and he said, I think we should declare war against Mexico. And his cabinet said, well, we really can't declare war against Mexico because the Mexicans haven't done anything. We've sent 4,000 American troops down into land that Mexico thinks is theirs, and we're waiting for something to happen, and it hasn't happened, so we can't declare war on Mexico yet. But then Polk finds out the next day that, in fact, an incident had happened 2 weeks before. Of course, news traveled very slowly then. And when Polk got this incident that he needed, he went to Congress on May 11th, 1846, and he stated, "Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood on American soil." Now, not to put too fine a point on it, this was a lie, and everybody knew it was a lie. The Whig Party, which was the opposition party, Abraham Lincoln's party, everybody in the Whig Party in Congress knew that, in fact, the land where the soldiers had been sent, where the army was currently occupying, had always been considered Mexican rather than Texan land. And a lot of congressmen, both Whigs and Democrats, write privately to each other after Polk makes this statement, well, the idea that this is American soil that blood's been shed on is pretty dubious, but the fact of the matter is, everybody lines up and they vote in favor of Polk's declaration of war. You can't really call it a declaration of war because Polk isn't asking Congress to declare war. He's saying a war is already going on, let's send support to the troops. So the Whigs are afraid of looking unpatriotic, of suffering under the label of not being patriotic. So all but 14 members of Congress vote in favor of declaring war against Mexico, and that's how the war starts. And the Mexican War is short. It's 20 months total, and only about 16 months of those are actual fighting. But as you're going to hear today, the war was not short enough for the American people. It was marked by a number of stunning military successes by the United States, such as the Battle of Buena Vista, where 5,000 US soldiers defeated an army under General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna of between 15 and 20,000 soldiers. Now the numbers, the ratio in the Battle of Buena Vista is obviously quite astounding, but the fact of the matter is that in almost every battle of the US-Mexico War, Mexican troops greatly outnumbered US troops, and yet the US won every single military engagement in this war, with the exception of the Battle of San Pascal in California, which Americans prefer to sort of think of as a skirmish rather than a battle. So that doesn't really count. Other than that, Americans win every single battle. There were 3 theaters of the war. In the first stage of the war, General Zachary Taylor secured northern Mexico with key victories, including this one at Buena Vista in 1846 and the first months of 1847. The second theater of war, General Stephen Watts Kearny travels west from Fort Leavenworth in Kansas through New Mexico, conquering New Mexico and all the way to California, and that happens about the same time. Now, unfortunately, neither of these tremendous victories bring what Polk wants, which is peace and the securing of California and Texas into the American Union. Mexico refuses to surrender despite the victories of both Taylor and Kearny. So Polk decides to send General Winfield Scott to invade central Mexico. He bombards Veracruz and travels through central Mexico, securing the capital in the fall of 1847. Now, in the eyes of Americans, it was sort of a foregone conclusion that their side would win, and win easily because most US citizens harbored a host of racist beliefs about Mexican men, foremost among them being that Mexican men were too lazy and cowardly to fight. Now, in point of fact, Mexican troops fought very hard, as you can see in this really rare print, Mexican print of the war. Mexico produced very, very few images of the war, so it's great when you find one so you can actually get a sense of how they're envisioning what's happening. Mexico lost all of these battles and ultimately lost the military side of the war because they had vastly inferior weapons. Their leadership was terrible. Mexico's government was in turmoil. They were broke. There were various battles where there actually, no money was even making it to the army to support itself. And because hostile Native American tribes in the north of Mexico had so ravaged northern Mexico that there was very little will to resist among a lot of Mexican residents in the northern part of Mexico. Now, on the Mexican side, most of the army was made up of conscripts who didn't tend to fight as hard as some other Mexican troops. But on the US side, most soldiers were actually volunteers. And that's a really interesting thing about this war. At the start of the war, support for the war was so overwhelming, particularly here in the Midwest, that many, many more men volunteered to fight than could actually be taken in volunteer regiments. So overwhelming enthusiasm for the war. And in fact, the Midwest provides the most troops fighting in Mexico. A lot of people think it's the South. It isn't. Missouri and Illinois are the two states that provide the most troops that go to fight in Mexico. Nonetheless, support for this war was not universal at the beginning. Here we have a campaign poster for Henry Clay, who was the Whig nominee in 1844. And his opponent in 1844 was James K. Polk, who ran on a platform of annexing Texas and expansionism generally. Clay opposes annexing Texas in 1844 because, as you can see from this poster, he believes that it's going to result in war with Mexico. And I love this poster when I discovered it. This is from a campaign appearance in Indiana. And if you look at the lists why you should support Henry Clay here from 1844, the first couple are really typical Whig economic positions. So the Whigs are generally the party of economic development in the United States in the 1840s. But when you get down to about the fourth reason, you can see, are you for or against the annexation of Texas? Are you for or against the assumption of Texas debts? Are you for or against an unjust and disgraceful war with Mexico? And then my favorite one, are you for or against national perfidy, dishonor, and disgrace? So this is in 1844. This is what Whigs are going to say. If you don't vote for Henry Clay, you're going to bring national disgrace on this country, and we're going to be in a war with Mexico. So clearly a lot of people could see the writing on the wall. In New England at the start of the war, anti-slavery sentiment was really widespread and also anti-war sentiment. So pretty early on in the war, the Massachusetts House of Representatives states that this war is immoral and they're going to oppose it. And a lot of New England intellectuals provide really trenchant critiques of the war. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, all these people speak out against the war in pretty strong terms. Now, I think that if opposition to the war had remained limited to New England, it would be interesting, but it wouldn't really be that different from what happened in the War of 1812. What you see happen, though, is that over the course of the war, New England stops being the only place where people protest the war actively, and you begin to see a national anti-war movement grow. There are essentially four main grounds upon which Americans oppose the war. The first one, which you can see very clearly in this poster, is on the grounds of morality, that this was an unjust war which would bring national dishonor on the United States. Congressman Joshua Giddings of Ohio repeatedly warned the House of Representatives that in order to be patriotic, people had to, quote, dissent from this aggressive, unholy, and unjust war. And he said, in the murder of Mexicans upon their own soil or robbing them of their country, I can take no part either now or hereafter. And Giddings, he was rather strong in his opinions, but that was a kind of critique that you see certainly by March of 1847, when the United States bombarded the town of Veracruz, leading to the deaths of a lot of civilians. So there was an anti-Mexican war critique that was based on morality. The second grounds upon which people critique the war were on the grounds of slavery. And Giddings, who I just told you about, he was an abolitionist, but it was not just abolitionists or people in New England who saw issues of slavery being really important to this war. So a lot of people felt like if the United States did in fact annex large portions of Mexico, it would make slavery spread and in fact make the slave power stronger. And again, it wasn't just people in New England who held this view. Consider for a moment this very popular print of the war. Maybe some of you have seen this. When you first look at it, it's kind of a a neat image of the power of newspapers in the 1840s. This is called War News from Mexico by Richard Catton Woodville, who was sort of a well-known and respected artist at the time. So at first it looks like kind of an image of people being enthusiastic about the war. They've just gotten news about the war in their newspapers. And in fact, the US-Mexico War was the first war where journalists traveled and were embedded with troops. So basically there were journalists who traveled with the troops and they wrote back stories. So this is the first war where people are getting immediate news about what's happening from a first-hand account from journalists traveling with the troops. But look at the image a little bit more closely. I should tell you, first of all, that Woodville was from Baltimore. He was not from New England. Notice how he places slaves right up at the front and center of the image. I think Woodville is really asking readers to think about the implications of slavery by putting the slaves there in the front of the image. And then also, if you look all the way to the edge of the image, you can see a guy who is tossing a match into a barrel. So this is also sort of suggesting, well, you know, what is Mexico really going to do except set off a firestorm? And again, this is an image from Baltimore about the war. Another major critique of the war had to do with what people saw as the impact of service in Mexico on the American character. So people actually argued that the Mexican War was making the American character worse, that in fact it was degrading American soldiers and turning them into the kind of people that we really didn't want them to be. This critique became especially strong after reports of very bad behavior by American troops made it into US newspapers, and I see that happening about the middle of 1847. Particularly in northern Mexico, the volunteers who I told you about behaved extremely badly. They murdered civilians in the street, they raped Mexican women, there were reports of entire villages being burned down, and General Zachary Taylor felt like he really couldn't control the volunteers. The volunteers were under control of their own commanders, coming from their own towns, and none of them really seemed to abide by the kind of discipline that Taylor expected and basically got from the regulars in the army. Here is one image of a massacre of 25 Mexican civilians by Arkansas volunteers who are known, by the way, as the Rackensackers, near Agua Nueva in northern Mexico in February of 1847. This was painted by a soldier from Illinois who actually claimed to see this massacre happen. He didn't have to see it. It was reported all over the United States. The Rackensackers were taking revenge on the people of Mexico for the murder of one of their own. So they sort of indiscriminately gathered up a bunch of Mexicans and took them into a cave and killed them. And this was a really widely reported incident, but by no means was it exceptional. In fact, a couple weeks after this happened, there was another massacre that was similar that was perpetrated by Texans. So when the American people read about this kind of behavior, it also helped turn them against the war. The St. Louis Republican was a newspaper that when it heard about this massacre at Agua Nueva, it initially claimed that it couldn't be true, so they denied it. They said there's rumors, but they aren't true. But then once the newspaper got verification of it, it actually wrote to all of its readers, it said, "Let us no longer complain about Mexican barbarity. Poor, degraded, priest-ridden as she is, no act of inhuman cruelty perpetrated by her most desperate robbers can excel the work of yesterday committed by our soldiery." So this is running an American paper. Now finally, the fourth reason, and perhaps the most important reason why the anti-war movement spreads and becomes a major force in America is basically racism. A lot of Americans felt like association with Mexicans wouldn't just corrupt American manhood, it also had the potential of degrading the United States altogether by watering down what Americans believed to be their Anglo-Saxon blood through the incorporation of Mexicans. South Carolina's greatest orator and intellectual, John C. Calhoun, who was a firm believer in the importance and the need of slavery in American society, was a very active opponent of the war with Mexico because he thought that Mexicans did not belong in the United States. He said, quote, "I protest against the incorporation of such a people. Ours is the government of the white man." And Calhoun was hardly alone. A lot of Americans really felt like Mexican land might be desirable, but having to take Mexican people with it posed a problem for the United States. Now, it wasn't just intellectuals, ministers, and middle-class Northern reformers making these critiques, one of the contributions that I think my book makes is showing the role that soldiers and officers actually played in the evolution of this anti-war movement. And so this brings me to Colonel John Hardin of Illinois, a gentleman that I already introduced you to, and who I've come to know very well after spending many hours with his family papers in Chicago. Now, Hardin, again from Jacksonville, was a former Whig congressman. He was part of a very wealthy and prestigious Kentucky family. He was related to Henry Clay, both through marriage and blood, a very tightly woven sort of Kentucky aristocracy. Hardin was the first man in Illinois to volunteer to fight for the U.S.-Mexico War. In fact, he was volunteering to fight for the war before it even started. He was repeatedly writing letters to Stephen Douglas, who, even though Douglas was a Democrat, was a good friend of his. And Hardin already had a lot of military experience. He had fought in the Black Hawk War. He was an officer in that. And he actually was in charge of kicking the Mormons out of the state of Illinois. So Hardin was a big military guy, also a political guy. And he really, really wanted to fight Mexico. He wrote letters to newspapers saying, this is our greatest possible opportunity to gain California for the United States. And if war is declared, I will be at the front of that movement. And in fact, he was. Now, Hardin is very, very excited about the possibility of taking a lot of Mexican territory. He's a big proponent of Manifest Destiny. But when he gets to Mexico, his views change pretty quickly and dramatically. When Hardin first gets to Mexico, he writes in sort of rapturous terms about potential silver mines that he's heard about. And he says, the silver mines here are supposed to be the richest in Mexico, and were only abandoned by, quote, the ignorance of the Mexicans. And he says it will only require a little skill to make these mines very valuable. So he's really excited, and he can see Mexico in American hands. But the longer he spends in Mexico, the less he liked it. In early December 1846, just a few months after he arrived in Mexico, he wrote his law partner, quote, there's not an acre in 500 here that a man in Illinois would pay taxes on. And the people of Mexico were far worse. Quote, I've never seen a drunken Mexican, he admitted. That's the only good thing I can say about them. They're a miserable race with a few intelligent men who lord it over the rest. 3/4 of the people or more are peons and as much slaves as the Negroes of the South. Treachery, deceit, and stealing are their particular characteristics. They would make a miserable addition to any portion of the population of the United States. To another friend, he wrote just a week later that the only difference between the peons of Mexico and the slaves of the South is their color, and he says, as for making these peons voters and citizens of the United States, it should not be thought of until we give all Indians a vote. So these are Hardin's thoughts on what's happening in Mexico. This transformation occurred after only 3 months in Mexico, and he told a third friend, he said, although I was for annexing all this part of Mexico to the United States before I came here, yet I now doubt whether it's worth it. So much for Mexico, its people are not better than the country. And Hardin's evolution from this sort of avid expansionist to a sort of a xenophobic cynic of the war was a rapid one, but it wasn't uncommon. Hardin's views were shared by many in the Army. Like I said, it was Midwesterners who initially showed the most enthusiasm for the war with Mexico, but many of them decided that taking parts of Mexico wasn't such a great idea after all. Their exposure to the land and people of Mexico led them to question the future of Manifest Destiny in the region, and frankly, their commanders were no more enthusiastic. Both Generals Taylor and Scott pushed for a quick end to the war and expressed reservations about the value of Mexican territory to the United States. Now, the national anti-war movement became particularly heated after Winfield Scott's troops captured Mexico City on September 14th, 1847. And here's an image of Scott entering Mexico City. If you look at the lower left-hand corner of this image, you can see a peon picking up a rock and preparing to throw it at the American troops. So this is an image that basically expresses the extreme hostility of many people in Mexico City to having their city occupied by American troops. Now, initially, as you can imagine, Americans were extremely enthusiastic about the fact that their army had conquered the capital of another country. But when Mexicans still refused to come to terms and come to any peace treaty, what began actually was a period of very, very bleak occupation that ended up being terrible for the army and terrible for the pro-war movement generally. The Winfield Scott's troops were subjected to daily guerrilla warfare by Mexican partisan forces, and there was really no end to the war in sight because Mexico still refused to give up. At the same time, a lot of expansionists in the United States, once the United States has captured Mexico City, begin to argue that, in fact, maybe the US should annex all of Mexico. After all, if you've already conquered the capital city of the country, why not take it all? And it's really at this point that people around the country begin to question whether this war should go on any further. The turning point in the creation of a national war movement occurs 2 months after Scott occupies Mexico City. On November 14th, 1847, when Whig Henry Clay gave a major anti-war speech in Lexington, Kentucky after the war, against the war. Now, Clay had been out of the public spotlight since his disastrous and terrible defeat by James K. Polk in the election of 1844, a defeat which he never expected and frankly could not believe, and a defeat that was probably caused by the fact that he opposed the annexation of Texas, which was hugely popular. Unfortunately, Henry Clay not only had to suffer through that defeat, but his namesake and favorite son, Henry Clay Jr., like John J. Hardin, although he was a Whig, volunteered to lead troops to Mexico. So Henry Clay Jr. becomes a leader of Kentucky troops, takes them down to Mexico, and he is killed at the Battle of Buena Vista, just like John J. Hardin is. So Henry Clay has to face the death of his son in this war that he did not believe in, and after his son's death, he becomes very religious. He gets baptized into the Episcopal Church, and he decides to make a speech opposing the war that he hopes will bring the war to a close. And Clay's speech, which is hugely important because reporters traveled over 100 miles to hear it, and the newly invented telegraph meant that within a couple days of the speech being uttered by him, it was reported around the country. Clay's speech really touched on all of those grounds for opposing the war that I mentioned. He talks about how immoral the war is. He says that the US has lost its sterling reputation abroad. He talks about American soldiers being disqualified by a wild spirit of adventure from returning to civil society. He says that slavery is a great evil and this might cause the spread of slavery. And he also makes it clear that there are racial reasons to oppose the war. Clay asked his listeners, does any considerate man believe it possible that two populations so incongruous, so different in race, language, and religion and laws, could be blended together in one harmonious mass? Now, after this sort of rousing speech, Clay called for mass meetings around the country to end the war. And people actually took him up on it. I've located over 30 meetings in support of Clay's anti-war resolutions from Indiana to New Jersey and Louisville to Maine. And this geographic scope of people who basically are meeting together in public forums and saying, yes, we need to leave Mexico and end this war immediately is well beyond the opposition of the War of 1812. And like I said, I think constitutes the first national grassroots anti-war movement in American history. Now, by the way, I should tell you that what Clay asked to have happen was for the United States to leave Mexico and not take any territory from Mexico altogether. So he wanted peace without any territory, which of course didn't happen. Now, just 2 weeks after Clay's speech, the 30th Congress convened in Washington, and guess who was there? Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln heard Clay's speech in Lexington because he was visiting the town on his way from Springfield to Washington, D.C. He was visiting Mary's family in Lexington, and while he was there, he got to hear Henry Clay speak. Now, this was a tremendous thing for Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had always idolized Clay. He called Clay his beau ideal of a politician, and to have the opportunity to actually hear Clay speak must have been a huge thing for him. Lincoln, when he was young, he carried around a book of Clay's speeches, and he used to read them to himself. And when he was a young man and a legislator in Springfield, he was the president of the Clay Club, and he asked Henry Clay to come speak in Springfield, and Clay didn't come. So this is really like Lincoln's opportunity to meet the politician that he respects and admires the most, and he heard Clay give this speech against the war. So perhaps it isn't surprising that when Lincoln gets to Washington, instead of talking about tariffs or any of the economic issues that had really motivated him as a politician, he decides to oppose the war. The first speech that Lincoln gives in Congress are what are known as his spot resolutions, where he basically gets up and he calls the president a liar for claiming that American blood was shed on American soil. He lays out this very lawyerly list of reasons why it wasn't American soil. That's his first speech. Lincoln's second national speech is a very, very dramatic attack on Polk and attack on the war. the highlight of which being Lincoln saying that he more than suspects that Polk is deeply conscious of being in the wrong, that he feels the blood of this war, like the blood of Abel, is crying to heaven against him. He knows not where he is. He's a bewildered, confounded, and miserably perplexed man. And I love this image. This is an image of Polk from late in his presidency. And Polk basically worked himself to death in support of this war. He worked incredibly hard, and you can see how much he's aged just from the picture that I showed you earlier, which was taken at the start of his presidency. So Lincoln adamantly attacks Polk. Most scholars who have looked at Lincoln's spot resolutions have said that his attacks were ignored. I found by looking at newspapers that this was not the case, that in fact the spot resolutions, and particularly the speech that you see here, was widely reprinted across the United States. So this is really Lincoln's first taste of national acclaim and attention. Now, little did Lincoln know, but the president actually was confounded, and here was why. Back in the summer of 1847, Polk dispatched a diplomat named Nicholas Trist to negotiate a treaty with Mexico. But once Scott occupied Mexico City and captured Mexico City, Polk began to think that, in fact, we should take more of Mexico than the treaty stipulated. Polk wanted to see Baja California in the United States. He wanted to see the state of Sonora in the United States. He had very, very expansive designs on what the United States should take from Mexico that were much more than he told Nicholas Trist to negotiate for. So he recalled Trist, told Trist to come home. And what ended up happening is that Trist refused to come home. Trist, along with Scott, who was a good friend of his by that point, decided that making a peace treaty with Mexico was the most important thing that he could do. And as Trist said himself, he wanted to make a treaty that was not exacting to Mexico. He wanted to save the Mexican people from a continuation of the war and from the dismemberment of the country. So Trist wrote the president and he said, I'm not going to come home. And he made a treaty, he made the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, despite the fact that he wrote to his wife, I will probably never work in Washington again. My career is over. And in fact, his career was over. Polk was so angry at him that he withheld Trist's pay when Trist returned to the United States. And Trist, his family became incredibly poverty-stricken. And it wasn't until after the Civil War, when Ulysses Grant was president, that Trist got another position. This is really at the end of his life, and he was given a sort of a not very demanding position running a post office in Virginia. But up until that point, Trist was broke, and his family suffered terribly because of this. Now, let me just kind of wrap this up and tell you sort of what I think the anti-war protests, the sort of context for them. The top quote that I have here is a quote from Polk from January of 1848, and this is what he said to his cabinet. He said at this point, he might be willing to accept a cession of New Mexico and the two Californias, meaning Baja as well as Alta California, and the passage across the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, paying for them a much less sum than Mr. Trist was authorized to offer, and in addition, we should secure the port of Tampico. And if you look at this map, which I've turned on its side to show the importance of the Gulf of Mexico to these negotiations, you can see various lines that sort of demonstrate where, what people wanted to take. Let me see if I can get this going here. So this is the initial line that Mexico offered in negotiations. And if you look here, this is really what Polk was hoping to take in January. So what that would have brought is an additional 1/3 of the country of Mexico into the United States than what ended up happening. Unfortunately, on February 19th, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo arrives in Washington, signed both by Trist, the negotiator who's no longer legal, and his Mexican counterparts. And Polk decides that he has to accept the treaty because there's no longer congressional support for the war. And he thinks long and hard about this, and he writes in his diary, he says, you know what, I'm going to have to accept this treaty even though I don't like it. And it's less than I want because, quote, the probability is that Congress would not grant either men or money to prosecute the war, and I might lose New Mexico and Alta California. So, you know, just to conclude here, did the anti-war movement achieve all its goals? Certainly not. I mean, Henry Clay wanted the United States out of Mexico without taking any territory. I don't know that that was an extremely realistic position, but this was Clay's position. Did the anti-war movement end the war? I feel pretty strongly that anti-war agitation, both in Congress and on the ground, forced Polk to bring the war to a close, even though he wanted more territory. So I think you can say it ended the war. I think it did limit the territorial acquisition from this war. I believe that had Polk been allowed to continue fighting, Mexico would have been forced to give up more land than it ultimately did. It definitely mobilized the public in support of bringing an American war to a close for the first time. So I think it's important to acknowledge that anti-war movements existed in the past, that they can work, they can have real effects, and they can limit the loss of life, because I think the anti-war movement that emerged during the US-Mexico War did all of these things. Thank you very much.